We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Beyond Earth webinar hosted by the Beyond Earth Institute. My name is Steve Wolf. I'm the president of the organization, and I'm really glad that you could join us for this incredible webinar today. I'm really excited, particularly about the timeliness of this program, and the response that we've received has been extraordinary. The title of today's program is Securing a Cislunar Future: Markets, Minerals, and Momentum. Just yesterday, Jared Isaacman, the NASA administrator, made some announcements on contracts that are going to be awarded relating to the Lunar Base Program. So at the outset, I want to congratulate the Blue Origin, Astrolab, Lunar Outpost, and Firefly on receiving contracts for NASA. It's very encouraging that NASA is taking these steps aggressively and in an expeditious way. It was only recently that he announced the lunar program, and so we're moving forward quickly, and that's what we want to see going forward. However, as Courtney Stead and I wrote in an op-ed about a month ago, we're concerned that space commerce and the commercial sector isn't really fully integrated into this mission profile. And we like to see this changed, and we want to continue working on that. In addition, we're also focusing quite closely on the LEO destination program. We're concerned that NASA seems to be backing away from this important program, which was to replace the ISS program and to help to stimulate a LEO economy. Again, we feel that there isn't quite the commitment there. We're going to continue to encourage NASA to put that and make that as a priority. I'm going to put links to recent writings that we've done on this in the chat field, but I think it's relevant to this conversation today, which really is looking further ahead. What is this lunar economy going to look like? What are the markets and so forth? We're also, and I also want to now, I'm going to turn the program over to Courtney Stead. I do want to mention that there's another Courtney Smith, who will be moderating the program. She is the project leader on the Beyond Earth report upon which this webinar is based. Courtney Smith is project consultant for APCO. It's an Arnold and Porter company. And before I introduce Courtney Stead, I'd like Courtney to make a few comments. Our next webinar in this series of webinars that we're doing that's connected to our reports will be on June 9th, and that will be titled On to Mars, Are We Ready? So with that, Courtney, if you could say a few words, and then we'll hand it off to the other Courtney.
Thank you. So I want to make a couple of points, one on infrastructure, and the other is I want to underscore Steve's point regarding the administrator, who we do consider to be a good friend of ourselves and Beyond Earth. But I do want to emphasize a point that Steve made. First of all, as you all listen to today's very timely discussion, you have to keep in mind that success and there are a lot of challenges ahead, but success is going to depend on infrastructure, reliable transportation, lunar communications, positioning, navigation, timing, and other foundational systems without which no durable commercial ecosystem can emerge. The other is that, with your forbearance, a quick personal note regarding Administrator Jared Isaacman. From the moment he agreed to speak at our space symposium a year ago, many of us admired and continue to admire his entrepreneurial vision and energy. He's brought urgency, he's brought clarity and strong communications to the role. But the leadership at NASA carries unique weight. And Jared's recent comments about the uncertain market, for example, for commercial LEO destinations, which Steve referenced, however well-intentioned, can influence investment sentiment in consequential ways. In fact, have, based on some comments that I've received from private investors. A NASA administrator, unlike his previous role as CEO, does not have the luxury of a personal opinion. Whatever he or she says, in this case, Jared, sends signals to the marketplace. So I humbly suggest that NASA's enduring role is to serve as a catalyst, enabler, risk reducer, and ultimately it's the entrepreneurs, the investors, the customers, people like Dr. Chris Savino and others in this virtual room who determine, in this case, which lunar and LEO markets succeed. So with that, I hand the microphone over to Courtney, a great name, by the way, Courtney,
Yep.
and I'll go on mute. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Speaking of mute and unmute, can everyone just be reminded to mute themselves if you have not done so already? Hi, my name is Courtney Smith, and I am pleased to be moderating today's discussion on the Beyond Earth's Working Group Report series, Securing a Cislunar Future. I've had the privilege of serving as the working group manager and writer for this report, and I'm very, very well informed about what we will be discussing today because of that. I want to start by thanking both Steve and Courtney at the Beyond Earth Institute for the chance to bring this conversation to a wider audience. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to spend a few moments grounding everyone in what the report is and why we wrote it, in case you haven't read it. The paper is titled Securing a Cislunar Future, Markets, Minerals, and Momentum, and it is a product of the Cislunar Economy Working Group. The working group brought together experts from industry, finance, academia, law, and operations to examine a region of space that is rapidly changing in character. When we talk about cislunar space, we are referring to the vast region between geostationary orbit and the moon, including the orbit influenced by lunar gravity. To give that scale some context for those less familiar, this region is roughly 10,000 times larger than the volume of space inside geostationary orbit. And within just the past few years, this region has shifted from a scientific curiosity into a strategic domain that touches national defense, commerce, diplomacy, and the broader economy. The report itself is built around a central conviction that the cislunar economy is no longer speculative. It is being redefined right now through decisions on infrastructure, investment, and international alignment. And our paper examines 4 interlocking questions to understand that. Where commercial markets are forming, what infrastructure is required, how these ventures should be financed, and how policy and international norms must evolve to keep pace. This paper also responds to a competitive reality. China is developing an international lunar coalition with the goal of an operational robotic base by 2035, and its motives appear less tied to economic expansion than to establishing space governance on its own terms. That context shapes much of what we will be discussing today. Today's panel is designed to pressure test the report's finding with practitioners who live these issues every day. And as a reminder, as we get into today's discussion, please use the chat function to post questions, and my goal is to weave them into our ongoing discussion or highlight them as needed. With that, let me introduce our 4 expert panelists joining us today. First, we have Hoyt Davidson, the founder and managing partner of Near Earth LLC, who will be bringing in the finance and investment perspective. Dr. Chris Salvino, CEO and founder of Lunar Helium-3 Mining, or LH3M, who will be bringing in the industry and resource extraction perspective. Dr. Jack Gregg, adjunct professor and author, bringing in our academic and strategic framing perspective. And last but not least, Dr. Andy Aldrin, associate professor in the Master of Space Operations at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, who's bringing in a bit more of the programmatic and operations perspective. With the introductions now complete, let's get into the substance and the focus of this concise report, focusing on concise responses to the questions I pose. First off, I want to set the stage and start where the report itself begins, with definitions. The report argues that cislunar space has shifted from a distant frontier to a domain central to American interest in security, commerce, and global leadership. That is a very significant claim, and I want us to ask our panel to help us unpack what it actually means in practice. So to begin, Dr. Greg, I would like to start with you. Our report frames cislunar space as the no longer speculative, but rather a domain being redefined through decisions on infrastructure, investment, and international alignment. When we talk about the cislunar economy, what do you see as its defining characteristics today, and what distinguishes it from earlier space economic models? Floor is yours.
Well, that's a pretty big question. To boil it down, the cislunar economy is going to be, and is planning to be, somewhat of a laboratory for further expansion into the solar system. So, by the way, from an academic perspective, it's a wonderful platform for a lot of research coming up, but that's a separate issue. The whole idea of establishing a space economy on the moon in cislunar space is something that's going to enable a whole host of things, from investment to industrial production to manufacturing and all the rest of that. And mining especially, in terms of resource acquisition throughout the solar system, is going to be pioneered through the cislunar economy. So just to kind of kick it off, that's kind of a context for it. Would you like me to get into some of the value propositions on this now, or do you want
Sure,
to?
you can go for it. And then as soon as you do, I'll hand it over to Hoyt to offer a little bit more of the investor's perspective.
Oh, okay, great. So I struggled with this for a while because I was trying to find a uniform, one-size-fits-all value proposition for the space economy, specifically the cislunar economy. And the way that I tried to get to it is by breaking it down to different constituents. So, for example, I nominate that a value proposition from the government perspective is high ground security, political capital, that type of thing, right? The value proposition for investors is pretty straightforward. It's a greenfield opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a new economy, which, by the way, in terms of regulation, is going to be minimally regulated at first, and then we'll kind of see what happens organically after that. And then the value proposition for individuals, which is really critical because those are the people who are going to support the legislation and all the rest of that supports it from a grassroots level. That's going to be, number one, is going to be jobs. So that's going to add a tremendous amount of value. Secondly, there's kind of the whole idea of GNP growth. And also, it turns out that roughly 62% of the US population is in some way or other connected to the investment community in terms of maybe their 401k, IRAs, direct equity investments, and so forth. And so as the space economy grows, they're going to see a direct benefit from that. And then just kind of an overall, because I couldn't find the right category for this, there's a kind of a global economic growth that's going to result from this, and kind of that old cliche that a rising tide lifts all boats. As the space economy develops, specifically through the laboratory of the cislunar economy, then you're going to see an increase in global economic expansion.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Dr. Greg. Hoyt, I'd like to bring you in here from the investor's vantage point. Does what Jack just described match what you are seeing in the deal flow and capital formation?
Mostly, but not completely.
Okay.
And there's some confusion about the definition. When I talk to investors, they seem to think about space in three buckets, right? There's the traditional space market from Sputnik till today, which is communications, voice, data, video, broadband connectivity. There's the PNT applications that we all use, and there's remote sensing. So all of those things are kind of the traditional market, and those are in Earth orbit, obviously. There's a new set of markets following the LEO constellations, like direct to phone. There's also the ISAM opportunities in space, servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, which will happen in Earth orbit first. So that's not quite part of our cislunar definition, but there are new applications that are starting to get funding. And some of those new applications, we're seeing checks written for Series B, C, D, even seeing Series H rounds of, 50, 100, 200, $250 million. So the market's starting to pay serious attention to some of these new non-traditional applications and starting to kind of invest in the winners, so to speak. The cislunar right now is mostly couple dozen earlier stage companies with lunar business models and great expectations. They're getting angel, pre-seed, seed, Series A sort of capital, good amount of interest. Again, all following from the lead taking by our government and this race to beat China back to the moon. So we've got great demand signals coming from government. We just saw, the NASA announcement for their moon base today that's all supporting it.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of seeing from investors these kind of three different markets, and they're all getting a phenomenal amount of investment compared to historical periods. So it's exciting.
Definitely. Well, that actually pivots really well into my next question, which is for Dr. Aldrin. I want to give you the chance to weigh in as well. The report describes a shift from that government-dominated enterprise to a multi-actor ecosystem. And, Hoyt just hit at this a little bit, but from your operational perspective, is that shift actually underway or is it more aspirational at this point?
Well, it's both. I mean, it's underway. I mean, if you're trying to walk to New York City and you take your first step, you're on your way. I think we're very much in kind of the initial steps of this. We really have to figure out if there's a there. I mean, we think there's water. We think we might be able to get it. We think we might be able to do something with it. I think we might have a little bit more certainty about helium-3. But we fundamentally don't know some of the science, and we're sort of jumping to the notion of customers, which is taking a few leaps of logic, if not faith.
It's a good stance to have. That lines me up to my next section, which is on Apollo lessons and sustained momentum. I want to turn to a question of durability. One of the lessons of Apollo is that scientific and political achievement does not always translate into sustained presence or a sustained market. Our report notes that, and the timeline of the funding for Artemis 4 and subsequent missions remains uncertain, leaving their future in political limbo, which raises the question about momentum. And since I have your attention, Dr. Aldrin, this question is posed to you. Due to you spending your career thinking about management and operation sides of the space program, I'm going to ask you to look back at the Apollo program and think about what lessons, positive or cautionary, should inform how we think about sustaining public interest, political will, and economic momentum this time around. And to add on to that, how do we avoid repeating the post-Apollo pattern? Very big question, very easy answer. Go for it.
No problem. It's not like I've ever thought about Apollo before either. So yeah, it's the political dynamic is going to be a little bit different, but it is the biggest risk we have to sustainability is going to be political. And so I mean, we know with Apollo what happened was we went there, planted the flag, got the t-shirt, did the footprints, and we're done. And politically, I mean, it was very clear what the political purpose behind Apollo was, which was to beat the Russians to the moon. So here's the concern I have. What happens if China beats us to the moon? And the probability of that, back to the moon, right? As my dad loves to say, been there, done that, got that t-shirt. What's going to happen? And I worry that we're kind of setting ourselves up here, that Administrator Isaacman has said we're going to beat China to the moon. Which would be great. But now we set ourselves up. And what happens if China gets there first? What happens to the budget? I mean, it's not hard to see a different administration without the same kind of support for it, with an emphasis on other things. That's after the Chinese get there, they're going to wonder what the justification is. Now, there are clearly justifications, but I think we ought to be pushing those harder. And I think NASA, and I know we talk about this a lot at Beyond Earth, NASA needs to declare, and I think the administrator is inching there if he's not there already, that the fundamental purpose for going to the moon is to determine whether or not we can create an economically self-sustaining presence on the moon. And that's no simple thing. But there's massive risk between where we are right now and an economically self-sustaining presence on the moon. And NASA's primarily function ought to be to reduce that risk. And we really should be kind of systematic about how we look at the risk burn down. And it's not just technical risk. In fact, the technical risk is the easy part. The economic risk, the market risk, are going to be, I think, the real driving risks.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Aldrin. I'm going to now turn this to Dr. Gregg to offer a little bit of insights from his perspective on the value proposition to taxpayers and policymakers. How do you think we should be making the case today in a new way Apollo never really had to?
Well, from my perspective, Apollo was an event, and what we're talking about with the cislunar economy is a process, and that's two different things fundamentally, and it takes two different points of view, two different perspectives in order to fulfill that process. And it kind of goes back in a simplistic way to a kind of a marketing idea. I mean, the value propositions we talked about a little bit earlier need to be socialized, need to be talked about, and we need to build awareness about those things across the board, not just to the general population as a public relations issue, but to legislators, to financial people, and so forth. And we're starting to see a lot of interest in that. I think a lot of the current interest is centered around SpaceX IPO, and there's a lot of other firms that are now getting a lot of benefit from that. For example, they're getting investment because there's a greater awareness, and so that goes to the point. I think it might be important also to kind of pull apart some of the perspective on what building a new economy is all about. And you can kind of think about it not as just kind of a one and done kind of thing. It's going to happen in multiple phases. And the first phase is, we can call that a frontier phase. And the second phase is more after an inflection point, then you get to a growth phase. Second inflection point is a mature phase. And the different elements of risk and return come into play. Higher risk at the beginning, more stability on return when you hit the mature phase, for example. So getting that perspective helps to understand where the investments are going to come in. If you're a firm potentially wanting to get involved in the cislunar economy, you can say, well, gee, what's our ability to manage risk? And if it's not very much, you may want to hold back. Or if it's great, if you think the return is the percentage of return is really worth the risk, you may want to get in earlier on the game and start to take a look at the dynamics of how a new economy is developed.
That's a really great point. And building on that question of value, I want to move from the abstract to the very concrete. Our report examines the multiple economic pathways, resources, data, manufacturing, biotechnology, and logistics. But it is very candid that helium-3 fusion remains a strategic long-term vision rather than a near-term commercial opportunity. At the same time, helium-3 has a very real terrestrial market today in national security detection, medical MRI imaging, and quantum computing and cooling. This question is best posed to no other than Chris Salvino, who is working, the work that he is doing is at LH3M, is very informed to respond to this. So from your vantage point, where is the near-term commercial case for helium-3? And how should investors and policymakers balance long-term resource bets against the near-term returns, particularly as China signals its own helium-3 ambitions?
Well, I'd like to echo the Apollo before we get into this, because I think it's really, really, really important. And it kind of comes back to follow the money. Who's paying for this? We all in here have a vision and an interest in space, if you ask the American taxpayer, the bulk of the people don't even know we've gone around the moon. So before we get into the helium thing, it kind of comes back to, I really think we should echo what happened with Apollo. Back when it was about communism versus capitalism, the value proposition was very clear. The economy is way better. We weren't $39 trillion in debt. And there were supposed to have been 20 Apollo landings. Now, what happened? There was only 6 because the American public got bored with it. They reflect to Congress. Congress listens to the taxpayer and they cut it after 6. Also, take a look at what happened with the recent Artemis 2 mission. Its direct sister was Apollo 8 that went around the moon, which was probably the largest viewing audience by population ever. And then if we look at what happened with Artemis 2, how many people actually watched that? So I think there's these lessons from the past that are really applicable to the future, and it comes back to following the money. Now, going back to your original question about helium-3, the use cases are the ones you mentioned. You cannot really detect well nuclear bombs without helium-3 in a system. But in the future, quantum computing, which is wickedly fast and will define strategic initiatives. If China gets quantum computing before we do, that's a problem. What does it have to do with helium-3? The only way for quantum computers to operate efficiently, they have to be cooled. So this wacky resource called helium-3 has 2 major purposes. It cools quantum computers down, and without it, it doesn't work that well. And it's the fuel source for fusion into the future. And as a fuel for helium-3 for fusion, so if you have nuclear fusion, which is an up-and-coming fuel source, there are 2 ways to thinking about fusion. Central fusion, like a major power plant, and if we use helium-3 as a fuel source, it's the only scalable green energy across the globe. Fusion that's being developed right now is using something called tritium. It's because we don't have helium-3 yet. So if you use tritium, it's not green energy. So the future scalable green energy across the globe that would be totally green is if fusion adopts helium-3. That's going to resonate with the public. Now, here's a fun one for maybe a topic for another day. There's decentralized fusion, which we are starting to talk about a lot. So if you put helium-3 into a fusion plant, helium-3, not tritium, if you put into a fusion plant, the insulation blanket is maybe 2.5 to 3 centimeters. Well, what the heck does that mean? Fusion with helium-3 can be done in the size of a football. Let's let that sink in. You could take theoretically helium-3 fusion plant and put it in a small town, power a small town off the grid, power potentially a semi-truck, power a car, or data centers. So when we think about fusion, we should think about it globally as a centralized replacement for power plants and potentially also now as a decentralized energy source.
Thank you for that. Hoyt, this is a squarely finance question as well, to build off of what I've just asked Mr. Salvino. The report notes that traditional venture capital models, which are focused on rapid returns, may not be sufficient for capital intensity and long timelines of lunar infrastructure projects. With that, how do investors evaluate opportunities like the one Chris just described, from your perspective?
Well, I don't think the investors like venture capitalists have the flexibility to give space, extra time to create return on investment because they just like space. Maybe a few of them do, but mostly the more patient capital is the public markets. And we had a go a few years ago with about a dozen space SPACs. Some didn't do so well. A few managed to survive and are doing quite well now. But we're about to enter into a new phase of public financing, and there have been a few companies that have gone public and are doing well. But with the SpaceX IPO coming next month, that should create a huge amount of interest and a lot of liquidity for all of the investors in SpaceX to reinvest in space. And I think we're going to see a lot more companies approach the public capital markets. And and achieve kind of higher levels of investment capital that doesn't have an exit horizon, right? It's more long-term capital. So that's, I think, very positive for the industry. The industry's really never had that. The only long-term patient capital was that of the billionaires like Elon and Jeff Bezos and others. So it's good to kind of stretch beyond these space billionaires to access some of these large capital markets.
Yeah.
And eventually, some of these applications will become more mature, and then we'll be able to attract, the private equity market and the traditional bank lending and debt markets, which we really haven't had mature enough markets and cash flows to attract those yet. So,
Yeah.
again, an exciting time in space finance.
An exciting time indeed. And that actually leads very well into my next question, which is also to you, Hoyt. One of the central arguments of the paper was that infrastructure, not individual missions, is the real economic unlock. In our report, one of the points is that concrete financing tools, including the recent amendment, well, not so recent, amendment of IRC 142, which allows tax-exempt private activity bonds for spaceports and even floats the idea of U.S. space sovereign wealth funds. And knowing that this is still within your domain, Hoyt, from a finance perspective, what type of shared or foundational infrastructure really matters the most, and which financing mechanisms are most likely to actually move capital in that near term?
So far, most of the infrastructure has been launch services related to launch services. That's doing very well. Uh, Satellite infrastructure satellite manufacturing has also done pretty well. I think some of the new infrastructure we need for cislunar economy is more like building the Transcontinental Railroad or the U.S. highway system. That kind of investment that's massive, but has the ability to create a tipping point and unlock a lot of a new investment from the private sector to come in on top of that infrastructure and create businesses. And I think this new moon base is part of that infrastructure. And so, again, very exciting that we've got 3 stages of investment, very aggressively to start building that lunar infrastructure that then will de-risk the infrastructure for a lot of other investors to come along behind that.
Great.
Can I jump in just a second on the infrastructure? Because I think Hoyt is spot on here. Infrastructure is important. But there are 2 pieces of infrastructure, very specific things that I think are going to be absolutely critical. One is going to be landing sites. And that's because when you land on the moon, you spew out regolith that goes for hundreds of kilometers. Some of this stuff goes literally orbital. It creates real danger for anybody who happens to be anywhere nearby, which there's a whole dynamic that we can get into, and maybe it's a completely different panel on the sort of opportunity for conflict that creates. But that's one piece of infrastructure. The other piece that may be more important is gas tanks. I mean, we don't realize that it takes about something between 9 and 11 kilometers a second, delta V, to get to Earth orbit. It takes about 10 kilometers a second to get to the surface of the moon and back. That's as much mass of fuel that you need to get from Earth orbit to the surface and back as you need to get to Earth orbit. That's a lot of rocket fuel. And rockets in space like to be a lot different than rockets that you launch from Earth. Rockets that you land on the moon and bring back tend to be a lot different. And so you really need to have orbital fuel depots in space at 2 places, somewhere near the moon and somewhere near the Earth. As it turns out, probably taking lunar propellants from the moon to low Earth orbit, that's going to be a tough sell, because if it's only going to cost $2,000 a kilogram to get the gas up there in the first place, I don't know that you're going to beat that. But having a fuel depot near the moon, pick your spot, L1, is going to make things much more efficient and enable routine operations going from low lunar orbit, L1 or whatever, down to the surface and back up, rather than sending a 1,000-ton, or excuse me, 100-ton vehicle down to the surface of the moon and bring it back up. Send something that's a little bit more efficient. So I think that's, a critical piece of infrastructure that we can start talking about now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even in our report, we emphasize the importance of flight cadence as a vital signal of market health. And so I feel like that goes into exactly what your point was right now about how vital it really is. And to transition, I do want to pose an additional question, and this one's going to be directed towards Dr. Greg, but to widen the lens to more of that international dimension, our report warns that China's lunar coalition is less focused on economic expansion and more on establishing space governance, with the goal of an operational robotic base by 2035. At the same time, mechanisms like the Artemis Accords through the safe zones offer an alternative model based on transparency and cooperative use. Now, Dr. Gregg, this question's for you. How should national space strategies and infrastructure choices influence whether the cislunar economy evolves toward an open, competitive market versus the alternative, which we're seeing, of a centralized state-led model? And to add to that, what role do mechanisms like the safe zones realistically play in shaping that outcome?
Wow.
Good
Well,
question, right?
thanks for the easy question. I think one approach is a kind of a hybrid of both of those options. When you think about different infrastructure and what it serves, you also have to think about what the net output of that infrastructure is. Does it serve a group of economic entities, or is it a kind of a standalone? So some of the things could be characterized as strategic markets, right? And those are more like, let's say, utilities, and they have a longer time frame and a different financial element to them. They also have a danger of becoming monopolistic in a way, so that you're not going to have multiple um, gas stations, and well, the gas stations maybe, but I mean gas supply or energy supply. That's not going to be a competitive environment, and so that's very horizontal. But you're going to have other areas that are more commercial markets, that are more vertical, and they integrate and they build on top of those more strategic markets. So I'm that my approach is that you need both of those in order to have some kind of sustainable infrastructure growth. By the way, I came across a term called moonfra, and moonfra is a term that's being used by investors and consultants right now. It is a term referring to moon infrastructure build out, and I think that was kind of interesting. That's kind of catching fire, and that there's a greater awareness in the investment community and in the business community about these issues and about the importance of funding these issues.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to turn to a quick question that is in the chat from Courtney Stad, because we're talking about, how communities are talking about the sustained presence. To turn to one of the questions, Courtney asks to Dr. Aldrin, making the point on the importance of the political system in ensuring continued momentum behind the Earth-Moon commercial space ecosystem. How risk tolerant will political leadership be, as well as the investment community, if it is highly possible we suffer the loss of life in the process of building out the new space economy? So, Dr. Aldrin, do you have any feedback or comment on that? And then I can open that to the rest of the panel if you'd like to provide commentary.
So that's a tough one. And I think part of the answer is that NASA's risk profile is massively different from commercial risk profiles for probably perfectly good reason. But I think um, it's probably unrealistic to expect NASA to back off and say, you know what, it's okay if we lose an astronaut or two along the way. It's just like war. We're in competition with China. Um, which I think to some degree was kind of the mentality of Apollo. I don't see NASA doing that, and I don't, that it is so ingrained in the culture. And so maybe the best way of doing it is by passing more operations off to the commercial companies. Maybe NASA's paying for them or partially paying for them. I think that may give us an opportunity to kind of back off the corner we've painted ourselves into, that any loss of life on a NASA mission is intolerable. I think that's a risk, and it's something that um, we ought to do a better job of thinking through beforehand. There's, risk assessment and acceptance, and then there's risk ownership. And I think NASA owns that risk right now, and maybe you can pass that ownership to industry. But we need to be thinking a lot further out into the future about that. And as I mentioned before, the risk of China getting there first is pretty significant because, like I said, we've said we're going to get there first. If they get there first, there's going to be an awful lot of so whatism.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add to that. I think that's a great comment. But if you look at what happened with Apollo, totally different risk profile. Many of the astronauts knew there's a good chance they weren't coming back. And the risk tolerance back then, it was just, I think NASA's mission back then is different from now. It was supposed to push boundaries. And when you have a system in which you can't accept a lot of risk, you're not really pushing boundaries. And another point about China, the Chinese centralized government has had these outlines for space for a long period of time, and they don't normally deviate. So when they say they're going to do something on the moon, just like they did with their orbiters, I think we need to pay attention. Our problem is every time we have a different set of people in Washington, the mood changes. We left the lunar space in 72, and we kind of abandoned it for 40, 50 years, and now it's a big rush to go back there. And ultimately, it's going to come back to who's paying for it. And as a side note, we should talk about at some point if there's time, the South Pole versus other parts of the moon. It is not an ideal place to go from a manufacturing point of view or a mining point of view. It's a great place if you want to do some research on craters.
To that point, there is a question in the chat asking if we could have the panel speak a little bit more to the methods of surviving the lunar night and a long-term moon base that might not actually be so long-term if it potentially doesn't have the ability to past 14 days of a lifetime. Potentially, Chris, you can offer some insights on that and we can open it to the wider panel.
Phenomenal question. NASA's been talking about nuclear fission reactor on the surface of the moon for a long time. There's at least 2 companies, if not more, that have submitted requests for information on what type of power plants they would put on the surface of the moon. You're going to need that to survive the night. However, that may be old school. Coming back to fusion, because if we can put a fusion plant on the moon, the fuel's sitting right there. So to survive the night, you're going to need fission or fusion. You're going to need something. The battery packs are not going to allow you to really survive from what we now know. So we'll be looking at some exploration, but I'm going to argue it may not be fission.
Yeah, I mean, that's much like the other parts of infrastructure that I talked about. That's going to be absolutely necessary, absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
But I think, these are things that we know how to do. The things we don't know how to do are actually make money on the moon.
Very good point. Transitioning to another question that we've gotten in the chat. We have a very active chat. This panel is on transparency and scientific cooperation and trying to understand how the U.S. can realistically balance transparency and scientific cooperation under the Artemis Accords with the fact that so much cislunar and broader space technology is now dual use. I'm going to pose that to you, Dr. Gregg, and see if you have any comments on it, and then open it once again to the wider group.
Well, I think there's 2 sides to that naturally, right? And so it turns out that transparency is a wonderful thing in terms of promoting markets and promoting trade and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, transparency can be used against you, and we've seen that with the fact that our IP, intellectual property, has been scavenged by the Chinese and others. And so that level of transparency kind of works against us. So it depends upon which side of the coin you want to focus on. I think in terms of, in our culture, in the Western culture, we kind of think of that as a positive, as something that's a virtue in terms of being transparent and open, and that transparency promotes trade. On the other hand, as I just mentioned, that can be used against you as a leverage. So it depends how you want to look at that.
Can I jump in there?
Of
Because
course.
I think there's kind of two levels of information sharing here. The first, for instance, NASA through conducting science missions with rovers, with their new drones, can do some base level prospecting that could be shared with our partners and maybe stolen by China or others. But that's really not the level you need to make major investments in mining operations and resource extraction. But it's maybe enough to tip some commercial companies to investing and doing the real serious level of prospecting and ground truthing that they need in order to invest in operations for extraction and processing. And that level of information, they're not going to share. That's going to be proprietary information that the companies hold on to.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I agree with Hoyt. In fact, I don't know how much military technology there's going to be on the moon that uh, I still kind of I wonder what the Space Force mission is. They talk about protecting commercial commerce on the moon. And that's great, but that's not really much. I don't think that's going to require a huge amount of effort. But Hoyt's right on the proprietary data, and there's a bunch of really interesting challenges that are going to come up because if you find a really cool crater, and Chris, for the moment, let's just assume craters are cool and you want the stuff in the bottom of them. Um, you don't necessarily want everyone else to know about it because you're not going to be able to establish property rights in any simple way soon. And I think the notion that somehow we're going to get a governance structure on the moon soon, I don't know. That's hard to do. We're not very good at that. And so how is that going to work, particularly when you think about one of the interesting things about the moon is, as I mentioned, when you land there without a landing pad, you spew a bunch of regolith. And so if somebody is on a crater, um, particularly if it's crew, humans on a crater, they probably have a legitimate claim to that entire crater for safety reasons only. But again, if in the gold rush, if you found a really cool gold claim, you had to defend that with a gun. And I'm not suggesting we're going to have to defend these properties with a gun, but it certainly creates lots of opportunity for conflict, not just between countries but between commercial entities, perhaps. And it's another thing we haven't thought through yet. I don't know if investors are worried about that in particular. And if you want, we can start talking about things like the LDC. But again, that could be a completely different lecture. But we do need to figure that stuff out.
We'll save that one for another panel altogether. But I would like to take this conversation a little bit more close to, home, Earth. A question in the chat asks, how can citizens, scientists, and groups of highly qualified tinkerers, like members of the Inspire 24's Innovation Center, become part of this growing economy, even when they don't have much hope of competing for the same opportunities at the big companies and governments? I'm going to pose this one to you, Mr. Salvino, for your remarks as someone that is actively pioneering right now, and then open it to the wider panel.
That's a good question I never thought about before, so you threw me off. They could, follow us or participate with us in our newsletter. We have a live series that we stream monthly too. So more than happy to have people come on board and get interested in part. In fact, that should be part of the narrative across the country, not just in the United States, getting the average citizen involved with this because otherwise they don't care. I mean, they don't even know where their electric bill is going to be paid for. They care more about their gas prices. And if you actually looked at the surveys recently, 90% of the American public doesn't even know we went around the moon. So the more we collectively can engage the public in a positive way, and for us, it's about green energy. In the future, if you want sustainable green energy across the globe, the only foreseeable way of doing that is with fusion and helium-3. So that's kind of our little mission on our end, is to get the public behind that concept.
So I actually want to kind of tee off on the public thing because this is some of you who know me, this has been kind of a long-term rant of mine. We keep talking about space as being a public interest program, and we've never really generated public interest, as Chris points out so eloquently. we need to get over that and think of it in terms of, uh, I'll get in trouble for this again, but as a special interest program. When we do something that generates some real value for particular interest groups, that's a solid constituency. And there is no greater constituency than the US economy. So, I mean, if we can do something that actually generates significant revenue for the US economy or other economies on Earth, that's great. Now, having said that, I'm deeply skeptical of how much where there are real markets that are going to support that. I think Chris is probably as close as anyone to a market that makes sense. But I'm not, like I said, it's hard to get to the moon. It literally takes as much energy to get to moon and back as it does to get off of Earth. And we spend it's hard. It's hard getting into Earth orbit. And so it's always going to be expensive.
Can I add to that? I think the initial market, and maybe it's hard to think of it as a market, is science and exploration. And maybe there's not a near-term dollar return from that market. It certainly supports the development of infrastructure and markets that do have a future economic return. But in the near term, it does provide engagement for STEM, for students, inspiration to the population, just as Apollo did. And we're finding that, we've got 66, 67 Artemis Accord partners now, and 70 something countries with space programs or space agencies. We're seeing a lot of interest around the globe in engaging their population, their citizens, their taxpayers, their students, particularly their students, in becoming a spacefaring nation. And so to me, that's the initial market, the science and exploration that we're supporting. And if NASA, through this moon base and its supporting of the CLIPS landers and the human landers, primes the pump, then other companies and universities can take advantage of that payload capacity to do their own science, their own experience, their own exploration, maybe even their own citizens, going to the moon. So in the near term, I think that's kind of the market. And then from that, we'll learn enough about the moon to start doing some real prospecting that'll lead to a resource application. But that's going to take more time to develop.
So Hoy, it's as an educator and a guy who runs a K through 12 space education foundation, I couldn't agree with you more that education is important. And in fact, kind of going back to my previous discussion about the importance of interest groups, the largest association in the United States is the National, what is it? Teachers Educational Association. I forget the acronym is. Anyway, it's massive. Now, space to them is a fairly small thing, but I think NASA could do a much better job of promoting education through space. What they tend to do is they use education as a means of promoting NASA, which is all great, but I think we could be making much better use of the magic of space because, kids love two things. They love they love space and they love dinosaurs, and they get over dinosaurs. They don't get over space. I mean, we see tremendous interest in this, but what we don't see is money. It's really tough to get money for education these days, particularly in the last few years.
Can I ask you, I want to bring up something for everybody about money, because you just brought up money. So thank you. If you look at the spend on Apollo, if my numbers are correct, during the Apollo era is about 4.4% of the federal budget. I think it's 0.4% now. It's tenfold less. How can we do anything large on the lunar surface with this budget? Is this budget marry up with the vision that NASA has for something at the South Pole? I don't see the numbers that up.
It doesn't, but I don't know that you're going to change it. I think, look, $25 billion is a lot of money. We spent half of that on human space flight. Most of the human space flight goes to exploration. And if you compare it to the rest of the world, let's throw China out, but I mean, the rest of the world might spend a couple billion. And so we're spending massively more than anyone else. I just think the idea of getting more money from the government is going to be kind of tough. We're never going to get back to, I mean, the 4% of the national budget is kind of distorted because we didn't have Social Security and a whole bunch of other stuff. Getting more money, I think, is a wonderful thing, but we've never been very good at it. In fact, we're doing much better now than we have for a long time. But I think we're kind of at a little bit of a high water mark right now, unless we react to China. I think the reaction to China is just as likely to be, okay, they got there. We're not going to fight for second. I don't know, but I don't think we're not going to grow this cislunar economy only through government money. We must have the government money, or we're not going to get anywhere as risk reduction. But I don't see the budget increasing.
And with that, I will ask that we conclude our remarks. The China question is very ominous. It is one that can, once again, it's an entire panel in itself, can cover the thoughts and commentary on that as it relates to everything we've discussed today. I would like to invite both Steve and Courtney back so that we can conclude today's panel. And before that, I do want to thank Hoyt, Dr. Salvino, Dr. Gregg, Dr. Aldrin for a rich and candid conversation today, also for your contributions to the report in itself, and of course to a big thanks to Steve Wolf and Courtney Stad at the BEI Institute for convening it today. And as we saw in the chat earlier, you can access our report online. Please download it. Please enjoy all 20 pages of labor of love. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Courtney. What a great job that you did. Really, hats off. I really, this is her first outing. It's hard to tell how because she's so professional, and that she represents that next generation. You know, all us, everyone else here is a bunch of old guys, and we need more Courtney Smiths to carry the torch forward for sure. Just such a wonderful conversation, particularly in light of where we are with the NASA's new lunar base initiative, and where is the private sector linking into that and not linking into that. There's a lot of uncertainty, and you guys really dug into so many of those issues, and here's one question before. And I'm curious what your reaction is. What is the place for the private sector if NASA is indeed going down this road of creating a lunar base mission in the way that it has traditionally done its space missions as a government-led, government-owned initiative? Where's the room for the private sector to come in? Where's the room for Chris Salvino, to come in as a private interest? Is that something that has to happen parallel, separate from what NASA's doing? Is there a way to integrate the two? And I just open that up to anyone as a final discussion point before we end this program.
Well, I'll start. The one thing I was disappointed in the moon base presentation was that they didn't talk about the integration of commercial activities. They certainly talked a lot about their commercial partners and that the contractors they were giving awards to, but there's nothing that said, and we welcome other commercial enterprises to kind of tie into our infrastructure that we're creating, and we want to create this ecosystem. There was no discussion about that. Similarly, there was very little discussion about welcoming our international partners. They sort of made the comment that there will be some future opportunities for our international partners to participate, but really no specificity or no strong encouragement. And I think it's that commercial engagement and integration and the greater use for our international partners that's going to solve the sustainability problem, particularly if the next administration doesn't have a lunar base at the same funding priority. So I'd really like to see that added to NASA's plans.
Mm-hmm.
I think the companies that were mentioned are private, but they're being paid for by the federal government. Ultimate question is, how can a private company pay for it without governmental money? And I love the analogy with satellites. And I'll be quick. In the 60s and 70s, we had clunky, one-off, government-paid, bulky satellites And that was a governmental sort of initiative to get the ground running, which is what NASA's supposed to do. And now low Earth orbit is dominated by satellites being produced on a manufacturing plant being launched in the dozens at a time, if not more. It's all private industry. The same thing may happen to the lunar surface, but ultimately, what is the value proposition, and what is the resource on the moon that would drive that?
So
I'll make one comment if I may. I'm sorry, and I know we're over 2 o'clock, but I want to remind all of us that Elon Musk had to fight his way in. He had to litigate his way into the commercial world. And although Andy and I go way back, and a lot of the antibodies have been mitigated, it's still a very NASA-centric approach. So it's going to be non-trivial for the entrepreneurs and the commercial folks like Chris and company. But the good news, I think Jared is a mindset where he's open to it, but it's going to be non-trivial.
Andy, did you want to make a comment?
Sure, I'll make a quick point, then I'd literally have to jump off to
Yeah.
an education call. Anyway, I think the single most important thing that NASA could do is state very clearly as a matter of policy that the goal of going to the moon is to determine whether or not we can create a economically self-sustaining presence on the moon, and to focus our programs on risk reduction to achieve that goal. That would make everything really clear. But it's hard for NASA to do that.
Dr. Greg, would you want to make a final
No,
comment?
I agree with this conversation and very much what Andy said, just to make it clear and concise so that everybody is kind of clear about what the objectives are. And once that's stated, then you can build a plan against that. Otherwise, you go all over the place.
Okay.
Well, thank you all again. This is an ongoing conversation. I expect to be interacting with all of you and the Beyond Earth Institute. Remember, our next webinar is June 9th, and it is going to be On to Mars, Are We Ready? So, in our tradition of looking deeper and further than perhaps what most folks are looking at in space at the moment. So we look forward to seeing you on that call. And again, thank you to our panelists, and especially Courtney Smith. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you. Bye now.